Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, Burnout and Balance Coach and Wellness Expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance. Hello, I am back today with another solo podcast. I'm getting great response to these. Thank you so much for everybody who's taking the time to send me messages. I love to hear that you're enjoying the podcast, and I love to hear your feedback on specific episodes. So if you've listened to one and it really resonated with you, send me a message. You can always connect with me through any of my social media channels. I'm at Wendy McCallum Coach on Instagram and Facebook. Or you can send me an email at wendy@wendymccallum.com. I would love to hear from you. And just a little plea, if you're enjoying this podcast and you haven't taken a second yet to go and leave a review on iTunes, I would love it if you would do that. I'm always happy for just a simple starred review, so you can go on there and choose, 1 to 5 stars to rate the podcast. That's always great. But if you have an extra second to leave me a little text review as well, with just a couple of, sentences about why you like the podcast or what your favorite episode was. I always appreciate that. And it really goes a long way to helping me get a bigger reach in terms of an audience with this podcast, and also helps when it comes to getting interesting guests on the show. So thank you very much for everybody who's taken the time to leave a review. I think I'm at over 50 starred reviews now. There were like 15 plus maybe 20 text reviews on iTunes. And I know that they're on some of the other platforms as well. So thanks to everybody who's been doing that. What I thought I'd talk about today is 5 ways that mindfulness helps to prevent burnout for women. And I have been talking a lot about mindfulness in recent podcast episodes, and this just felt like a good topic for right now. I think everyone is feeling close to burnout. Certainly everyone that I've been talking to in terms of my clients, but also my friends and my family, of a year plus of pandemic, stress, anxiety, lockdowns, homeschooling, Zoom calls, being with the same people for more time than we have ever been with the same people, isolation, loneliness, inability to access some of the things that we kind of maybe were taking for granted, like our gyms and restaurants and social gatherings. So I think really burnout is at an all-time high, and I wanted to address that today in this podcast with some really simple tips. Again, I'm all about the simple tips, so everything that I'm going to explain to you today is, I think, going to be really accessible and make sense to you in terms of how a simple mindfulness practice, which can literally be 5 minutes of meditation a day, 5 minutes of breathing a day, 5 minutes of gratitude a day. Any of those things qualify for a simple mindfulness practice. 5 ways that simple practice can actually help you to prevent burnout. And I've always found in my coaching, this has been an approach that I've taken since the very beginning, and I do this in all of my corporate wellness presentations, whenever I'm speaking to groups, also when I'm coaching one-on-one, that it's most motivating for us as humans when we understand physiologically and scientifically the connections between habits, practices, behaviors, and strategies, and how we actually feel. So I'm going to get into some of that today as I talk about the ways that mindfulness can help to prevent burnout. So what is burnout? Well, just to kind of summarize, if you haven't listened to the Burnout podcast episodes yet, go back and listen to those. I did 2 with Sarah Bailey on burnout. We talked about burnout and adrenal fatigue. And then the second part of that series of episodes, we talked about ways to prevent burnout. And those 2 episodes are 2 of my most popular podcast episodes. So go back and take a listen to those if you're somebody who feels like they're struggling with burnout. But let me just quickly tell you what burnout is. Basically, burnout is unmanaged chronic stress. That's the simplest way to define it. So we just have too much stuff on our plates. We can't manage it all. We don't have very good stress management practices in place to help us deal with the excess mental stress, but also physically, the cortisol that is created from being in chronic fight or flight, just being chronically stressed. We just don't have the tools and strategies in place to manage that, and it starts to catch up with us. That is burnout. In the naturopathic world, that leads to something called adrenal fatigue, which again, Sarah Bailey, who is a naturopath, talked about in that episode at the burnout episode. She talks specifically about adrenal fatigue and how that plays out in our body and what that looks like. All I want to focus on today is how burnout makes you feel. Now, there are lots of different signs of burnout. It's a difficult thing to diagnose. I don't diagnose or treat. I am not a health practitioner. But when women come to me and they have either self-diagnosed burnout or they have been told by someone else that they are probably in burnout or getting close to burnout, I always say, okay, that's enough. If you're feeling burnt out, that is enough of a reason to start making some positive changes. It doesn't really matter where you fall on that spectrum. If you're feeling burnt out, there are lots of things that you can do to help relieve some of that pressure and hopefully prevent you from getting into full burnout. Burnout is characterized, as I said, by a number of different things. I'm going to run through some of the most common signs of burnout for you now. So the first thing that happens with burnout is that we start to feel exhausted. There's mental and physical exhaustion, almost always present in burnout. The second sign of burnout is that you start to develop a glass half full cynical attitude. So women will often say to me, I used to feel, pretty positive about life. And for the last 6 months, year, 2 years, I've just been getting increasingly pessimistic and cynical. That is a sign of burnout. Decreased work performance, which usually shows up as decreased focus and productivity. So women have a harder time focusing on the task at hand and actually creating work product. It's just more difficult for them to be productive. Another common sign of burnout is being preoccupied by your job when you're not there. So that means you bring your job home all the time. You're always thinking about work stuff. I've said this before on this podcast. This was a huge sign of burnout for me when I was still practicing law. In the last, 4 or 5 years when I was practicing as a partner at a large law firm in Calgary, I had a notepad by my bed, and I would wake up in the middle of the night and turn my little light on and write notes on files about things that I was worried I was going to forget the next day. I never stopped thinking about work. It was always in my mind. I had 2 really cute little kids at the time. They were, 2 and 3 during this time period. They were the cutest things, and I could not spend time with them and not be thinking about work. It was just always weighing down on me. It was like a cloud that followed me around. That's a really common sign of burnout, being preoccupied by work when you're not there. Another thing that happens in burnout is that we stop taking care of ourselves. So we stop eating the way that we know we need to eat to feel good. We stop exercising. Our sleep suffers. We start to rely on unhealthy coping mechanisms more often than we ever have before, and in a way that is unhealthy. So those unhealthy coping mechanisms might be food, they might be alcohol, it might be social media, it might be shopping. There are many different coping mechanisms that women use to try to escape or numb. And when we start to rely more on those, that is often a sign of increasing stress and burnout. Another sign of burnout is friction in personal relationships. So your relationships at home start to suffer, and your relationships at work start to get a little bit irritated, for lack of a better word. You have a hard time dealing with the people that you work with, so they just start to deteriorate. And then another thing that this is another one that I've said all the time. This is exactly how I felt. I used to say, I don't get it. I have everything that I wanted. I tried so hard to have this family. I went through all kinds of heartbreak to get where I am, which, by the way, I'm hoping to do a podcast episode on that story at some point, which I hope will be helpful to many women out there. But I used to think to myself, I worked so hard and went through so much to have this family, and this job is a dream job. And then they made me partner, and I've got this great house, and we're financially stable, and I've got a good marriage. Why is it that I don't feel happy and satisfied? Why am I so unhappy? This doesn't make any sense to me. So there was this increased dissatisfaction with life, and that is a very common sign of burnout. And then the last thing, unfortunately, that often happens is in burnout when it is left unchecked, and we don't do anything to try to get out of the burnout and manage our stress and relieve the pressure that we're under, is that we end up with some health consequences, and they can be quite serious. So it can be things like obesity, depression, high blood pressure, high blood sugars, all of those conditions and so many more can be associated with burnout. So that doesn't always happen because you can change the course of this. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, yeah, I'm starting to feel burnt out. First of all, like I said at the beginning, yeah, of course you are. This has been the hardest year for so many women. We have so much more on our plates. We're managing we have this whole third shift now that many of us are managing, which is kids at home most of the time. It's really, really tough. Many of us are trying to balance that with working from home now. And, for periods of the year, we've been homeschooling or managing schoolwork more than we normally do. And all of that, along with the additional stress and anxiety of just living in this pandemic and all the stress that comes with that, is leading to higher rates of burnout. So if you're feeling, I'm kind of on the edge here, I could be headed towards burnout, or maybe you feel like you're already there are things that you can do. And so again, this podcast will give you 5 of those. I'll give you, it's really just the same tool, but it has 5 different benefits when it comes to helping you to manage burnout. So again, the tool is mindfulness. And I have talked about various mindfulness practices in other podcasts. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail around them, but what I'm talking about is meditation. And again, meditation can be so simple, and it can literally be 5 minutes a day. There's an entire podcast episode on meditation, like the basics of meditation. Please go listen to that if you're curious about meditation as a tool. The second mindfulness practice is gratitude. I've also done an entire podcast episode on gratitude. So that's another one that you can go listen to if you are swayed by this podcast to try to start incorporating some regular mindfulness in your day. And the third little practice that I haven't spent as much time talking about, but that I did touch on in those podcast episodes with Sarah Bailey around burnout, is breathing. So basic breathing exercises. This can be as simple as breathing in for 4 counts and breathing out for 4 counts and repeating that. So breathing exercises don't need to be really complicated and fancy. There are all kinds of different practices out there around breathing, and huge bodies of research now around how different types of breathing can impact our health. But I just want you to think about some simple ones. So really what we're talking about here is pulling your body out of the breathing pattern that is associated with stress, which is a shallower, more rapid pattern of breath, and into the breathing pattern that is part of what's called the relaxation response, which is the second part of stress. And that is a deeper, slower pattern of breath. When we choose consciously to change our breathing pattern, so we just slow ourselves down, pause for a moment, and actually consciously change our breaths. We breathe in nice and deep and slow, and then we breathe out nice and slow. And we just get into a pattern. We do that 5 to 10 times. What we're doing is signaling to our brain that we are actually okay to relax. The saber-toothed tiger is no longer chasing us. It's okay to relax, which means it is okay for our brain to signal to our adrenal glands, it's time to stop pumping out the cortisol and adrenaline. It's time to move into the relaxed mode. So breathing is the third practice that I throw into mindfulness because it requires mindfulness to do those breathing exercises. You have to recognize, oh, wait a second, I'm spinning out of control here. I'm getting really stressed and anxious. It's time for me to stop, pause, and actually do a little bit of breathing. So those are the 3 practices, simple practices that I'm referring to today around mindfulness: meditation, gratitude, and breathing exercises. Any of those things, if they're done regularly, will have the 5 benefits that I'm about to talk about in relation to preventing burnout. So what's the first thing that a practice of mindfulness will do in terms of helping you to manage burnout? It's going to help you say no more often. And here's why. When you engage in any of those practices that I was just talking about, they are all going to help you get better at being in the present moment, at stopping and actually focusing in on what is happening around you right now. So with the breathing, you're going to be focusing, for example, on your breath coming in and your breath coming out. And when you do that, that is pulling your brain into the moment that you're in, and your brain is focusing on what's actually happening, which is the air coming in and out of your body. So same thing with gratitude. When you're taking the time to be grateful for things, you are in the moment when the thing is happening. You're in the present moment, noticing the really amazing thing that has just happened. And so that, of course, requires you to be in the present moment. Same thing happens with meditation. Meditation is all about training your brain to be in the present moment more often and to let go of thoughts and pull yourself back to what's actually happening in that moment. So all of these practices enable you to get better at being in the moment. And if you are in the moment, you are far less likely to say yes on the spot when someone asks you to do something. If you're actually present and thinking about what is going on and paying attention to the request that is being made of you, you are far more likely to consider it with some thought and make a decision that actually serves you, which a lot of the time is going to be to say no, especially if you're overwhelmed and burnt out, which you are because you're still listening to this podcast. So it gets easier to say no when you are more present in your life, because you're just less likely to react without thinking. If you're mindful, right? You're less likely to just say yes because that's what you always do. So a key piece of preventing burnout is saying no more often. I actually think I did a podcast on that too, how to say no more often. In order to get good at saying no more often, you need to get better at being in the moment. And all three of these mindfulness practices help you to do that, right? You're in the place that you're in with this overwhelm because you say yes to everything, because you are not very good at putting your needs above the needs of other people. So saying no is the most important piece of getting out of burnout. And I spend a lot of time talking to my clients about that. And whenever I do corporate wellness presentations around stress and time management, that's a piece of it. How to say no more often and more effectively. Okay, so that's one way that mindfulness can help you to prevent burnout. The second way that mindfulness helps us to prevent burnout or recover from burnout is that when we are more mindful, that helps us to reduce our reliance on unhealthy coping mechanisms. Now, remember, that was one of the signs of burnout. An over-reliance on unhealthy coping mechanisms. That's my jam as a coach. This is what I do. I help professional executive women who are nearing or in burnout come out of burnout and reduce their reliance on unhealthy coping mechanisms. So I know this better than just about anything else. And there is a direct correlation between burnout and relying too often on things that don't serve us. And so getting more mindful helps us to break those patterns. Because again, if we're not mindful, we're not in the moment, we're not present, when we are feeling an emotion or having some thoughts that feel uncomfortable that we don't really want to be with, our instinct is going to be to reach for the thing that's going to help to numb us. And the thing that helps to numb us might be cookies, it might be a glass of wine, it might be our phones so that we can go down the rabbit hole that is social media. Anything that will allow us to escape. How do we start breaking that over-reliance on unhealthy coping mechanisms? We have to get more mindful and in the moment. We have to get more present. Because again, if we're more present, we have a much greater likelihood of pausing before we give ourselves the thing and asking ourselves questions like, what do I really need? What is it I really need right now? Because chances are it's not a glass of wine, you guys. It really never is. It's never a glass of wine. Sometimes it is food, but it's not usually donuts. It's that you're actually hungry and you need something nutritious. So when you're feeling that craving or that urge to have the thing that you're trying to use less as an escape mechanism or as a numbing tool, you have to stop and ask yourself, what is it that I really need right now? And then you need to give yourself that thing. And the only way to do that is to actually be present. If you're not present, again, you will have already drank the glass of wine, eaten the cookies, or picked up your phone. That will have happened instantly. So again, a regular mindfulness practice can help you to use those unhealthy coping mechanisms less. Break some of those habits that aren't serving you. For example, in the moment, you might want to ask yourself, am I hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? That's the HALT acronym, and it is a really great tool no matter what the thing is that you overuse as a coping mechanism or as a numbing tool. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. HALT. So you pause, you halt, and then you say to yourself, wait a second, hold on, what's going on here? Am I hungry? If I am hungry, what is it I really need? Well, I really probably need some filling, satisfying food. Am I angry? Okay, if I'm angry, what do I need? Chances are if you're angry, you need to release that emotion somehow. And you can do that in a number of different ways. Talking to somebody about it is one of the best ways. So actually having a conversation with someone and maybe doing a little bit of venting can be really helpful. Or maybe you just need to go for a long bike ride or a run to kind of work it out, or punch a pillow. But what you don't need is a glass of wine or, a bag of chips. That's not going to help you process that emotion at all. So that's hungry and that's angry. The next one is lonely. Am I lonely? Loneliness is a big one. And I always say, like, am I lonely or bored? Because they really go together. And sometimes they're hard to distinguish. But if you're lonely, what do you need? Well, you need some connection. And you know what? Right now, a lot of us are lonely. Even though many of us are living with people 24/7 in lockdown situations, it can still feel really lonely because we're just not talking to each other as much in many of these situations because we've been together for so long. We're starting to get on each other's nerves, or we feel like we've talked about everything we can talk about. And then, of course, the opposite situation is also happening a lot right now, where women are feeling isolated because they are actually physically isolated. They live alone and it's COVID. And so they're having a really difficult time connecting and maintaining some sense of community. So if you are lonely, you need to reach out. You need to find that community. And there are places to find that community. Obviously, you can start with your own social network in terms of your friends and family, but there are also places online now where you can find that community. So many amazing communities have been created through the course of this pandemic. There are lots and lots of support communities out there around alcohol, for example, tons of them now. And I actually have a small community. So I have a small group that I run around alcohol. Right now we have 11 women in it. And that was born out of this pandemic too. I just realized there was a real need to create some kind of a community coaching program for women. So again, if you're lonely, you need connection. If you're bored, you need something to do, but it's not drinking or eating. You have to find something else to do. If your brain's not stimulated, find something to do. Go get creative. And the last one, of course, is tired. And if you're tired, you need to rest. So HALT is a really great tool in the moment, but you're never going to use it if you're not mindful, if you're just reactive. If you haven't trained your brain to kind of slow down and pay attention to what's going on in the actual moment that you're in, you're just going to reach for that numbing agent. And you're going to do it right away without thinking. And by the time you realize that you're doing it, it'll probably be too late. So mindfulness really helps you reduce your reliance on unhealthy coping mechanisms, which of course is one of the signs of burnout for women. The third way that mindfulness can help to prevent burnout is that it can change the way that you react to triggers emotionally. So this is different than the unhealthy coping mechanisms, although they are connected. What I'm talking about here is that regular practices of mindfulness give you something that I have heard referred to as the golden pause, which I think is just such a great way to describe it. And I don't know who to attribute that to. I apologize. I heard it ages ago and it just stuck with me. And it's something that I have noticed has happened in my own life as a result of practicing more mindfulness, just engaging in more mindful activity, is that I find that I have this golden pause that I did not have before. And what that is really is just like a split second more time before I react. So it's like a little bit of a delay, but it's really, really tiny. I can feel it, but I would guess that if I measure it, it's less than a second. But it's just enough time for my brain to just actually make a decision about whether reacting makes sense. So what that means is that I have time to ask myself this question, which is one of my favorite questions. Could I care less? So when something really bothers me or something big happens, it feels really, scary, or it feels really annoying, or whatever, it just provokes anxiety or stress in me, I have this golden pause or this split second where my brain actually has time to process the question, could I choose to care less about this? And what would happen if I did? And oftentimes when I go through that question, I make the decision, it's not worth it. I'm just not going to react. I'm going to let this one go. Or I'm going to react differently. I'm going to react calmly to this. Whereas before I was in the habit of practicing all of these little mindfulness things that I do fairly regularly, I would just react. So I would find myself just moving directly into anger, directly into judgment, whatever it is, in that moment. So that golden pause can be so helpful when it comes to keeping you calm, which means keeping you out of fight or flight, which means keeping your cortisol down. And of course, burnout is basically chronic fight or flight. It's when we're stressed for too long. And so when it comes to preventing burnout and recovering from burnout, the main goal is to manage our cortisol better. It's to manage our stress better and to figure out a system that allows us to be in the relaxation response, which is the second part of the stress response, where our cortisol is actually lower and we feel calm. We want to be in that more often. And so this golden pause can really help with us that because it can prevent the number of spontaneous reactions that we have to things without actually thinking about whether that reaction is going to serve us or not. So that's the third way that mindfulness can help to prevent burnout. It can help us to react more calmly to triggers. The fourth way that mindfulness helps to prevent burnout is that all of these practices that I'm talking about, gratitude, meditation, conscious breathing, all of those practices physically have the result of reducing our cortisol. They will bring our cortisol down. And there are a couple of different reasons why that happens. One is that at least in two of those things, in meditation and breathing, the breathing exercises, we are actually consciously choosing to breathe differently. So in any meditation, that's going to happen. So a lot of the time when we meditate, we're actually using breath as our anchor. So we're focusing in on our breath. That's the thing that's helping us to stay in the present moment. And so we're breathing in deeply and, slowly. And so our breathing pattern will change when we meditate. Our breathing pattern obviously also changes when we choose to do breathing exercises. That is the first domino in the fight or flight response. What I mean by that is the first symptom that changes as a result of elevated cortisol and adrenaline in our body when we go into fight or flight. It's our breathing. So our breathing goes from a slow, deep breathing pattern to a shallow, more rapid pattern of breath. So when we consciously choose to change our breathing pattern, we consciously choose to reverse the first domino. And that reversing that domino has the effect of calming our body down and basically reversing all of the other symptoms that occur when we go into fight or flight, like elevated blood pressure, increased heart rate, contracted muscles. All of those things go back to normal when we change our breathing pattern back to a deep, slow breathing pattern. That is the breathing that happens in the second half of fight or flight, which is the relaxation response. So those practices actually help to push us into the relaxation response. Guess what happens in the relaxation response, guys? Our cortisol comes back down. So from a physical perspective, these mindfulness practices help us to reduce our cortisol. Now, gratitude is a little bit different. In that it doesn't automatically change our breathing pattern to be grateful for something. But when we're in the present moment, we tend to be much calmer. We are not in an anxious state if we're in the present moment, because anxiety is based on a future event that hasn't happened yet. So whenever we pull ourselves back to the present moment to observe the good things that are happening around us, there's a very low likelihood that we're also feeling anxiety. So that will also mean that we're not in fight or flight, because anxiety will also push us into fight or flight. So I think gratitude probably has the same effect, which is to help us to manage our cortisol, because we're pulling ourselves into the present moment where everything is okay, you guys. Right now in this moment, Everything is okay. How do I know everything is okay? Well, it's because you're listening to this podcast. And if everything wasn't okay, if the shit was hitting the fan, you would not have the time to be listening to this podcast. The thing is, in the present moment, it's almost always the case that everything's okay. And so that's why it's just so powerful to learn how to be in the present more often. So that's the fourth way that mindfulness helps to prevent burnout. It actually helps us to manage cortisol. These particular practices that I'm talking about help us to bring our cortisol down. And the last thing I want to talk about, so the fifth way that mindfulness helps to prevent burnout is that it allows us to experience more joy. So regular mindfulness practices allow us to increase our daily joy. Really simple how this works, you guys, and it's all connected back to what I've been talking about, this idea of being in the present moment more often. The more often we are in the present moment, which is exactly what mindfulness trains our brain to do, the more likely we are to see the really amazing things that are happening all around us, the little stuff. Today, I was eating my lunch at the table, which I talked about actually in a recent podcast. I was talking about taking a break at lunch as being a really great way to slow down, just getting into the habit of actually eating somewhere other than your desk. So I was doing that today because, of course, I try to walk the talk in terms of what I suggest on this podcast and to my clients and in all my presentations. So I was sitting at my table eating my lunch and looking out the window. I did not have a device with me. I was just taking 10 minutes to eat my lunch. And I saw that this tree that kind of grows up between two pieces of our deck, there was a piece of it that was visible and it had started to bud. There was green foliage coming off of this tree. And that was a moment of pure pleasure for me because it's the beginning of spring, but it some days feels like winter. And it is really nice to be reminded of the fact that spring will actually come. So if I had not been present in that moment, if I'd been on my phone or I'd been sitting at my computer desk working, or I had been talking to someone else or watching television or whatever, I would not have noticed that. And I would have deprived myself of that little moment of joy. That's just a really small example. Those things happen all the time. It happens with my kids. If I'm actually present and paying attention, I will have meaningful conversations with my kids. They're teenagers, so those conversations might be, 4 seconds long, but that might be the only time during the day that my kid actually talks to me some days, to be perfectly honest. And all of you moms of teenagers out there, you know that this is true. Some days they're just so busy with their own lives that we don't even get to see them. My kids are 17 now, so they're not around that much. If I'm not present, I'm going to miss those moments. And those are the moments where the joy lives for me. So getting better at being in the present moment by using these simple mindfulness tools that I've been talking about in these other podcasts and that I've summarized today is the key to increasing your daily joy. Gratitude is a huge piece of that too, you guys. I talked about this on the Gratitude podcast. It's the reason why I love gratitude so much. Gratitude is all about noticing these moments of joy and actually recording them. And the more we do that, the better we get at noticing them when they're happening and registering them in our brain and then registering them again on paper, at least in the beginning. So with gratitude, you want to be journaling gratitude for about 30 days minimum. What we're doing is we're reinforcing this new neural pathway, which is I see good stuff all around me. And for most of us, that's not a default pathway. The default pathway for most of us is the sky is falling. It's not a positive pathway of there's all this amazing stuff happening all the time. I just have to open my eyes up and I will see it. With a gratitude practice, we create that pathway and eventually it becomes the default pathway so that when, like me, you sit down at your table to eat your lunch, you see the new green leaves. That's the first thing that you see. So gratitude is, I think, when it comes to increasing joy, of all of these mindfulness practices, I would say it's the number one practice. You're going to get the biggest bang for your buck from gratitude. So just to recap, those are just 5 ways, and there are so many more, you guys, but 5 ways that simple mindfulness practices like 5 to 10 minutes of meditation a day, regularly recording 3 specific things that happened that you're grateful for, or regularly pausing during your day to do some conscious, slow, deep breathing to help relax you can help to prevent burnout. So they are It helps you to say no more often, which is really important when it comes to preventing burnout, because one of the reasons why we're so stressed out is because we just say yes to too many things. We have too much stuff on our plate. It helps to reduce our reliance on unhealthy coping mechanisms because it allows us to pause before we reach for them. And it allows us to ask the most important question, which is, what is it that I'm really feeling and needing in this moment? It helps us to react more calmly to emotional triggers. So just to fly off the handle less. It gives us the ability to actually pause and ask ourselves, could I care less? Is there a way to respond here that might actually diffuse this situation or serve me better? Mindfulness practices, the physical practices of mindfulness are also really helpful when it comes to managing cortisol, because they push us into a different pattern of breath, which signals to our body everything's okay. It's okay to relax, and it's okay for cortisol to come back down. And finally, they allow us to experience more daily joy. And as I have said at the end of a number of these podcast episodes, if that is not the goal, I do not know what it is. The goal has got to be to have better days. We have no idea how long we're going to be here for. So, the way to live this life to the fullest and to really just, smash your life goals is to figure out how to feel the most amount of joy every day. It's got to be the goal, you guys. And so if you're walking through your days and you're feeling like, oh, I just can't wait for this day to be over, then you're missing out on all the stuff that's happening around you. And listen, I know life is tough. I know there are lots of hard things going on right now, but there are always lots of really good little things happening too. The problem is we're blind to them. We literally have our blinders on. And we're just going through the motions. And so mindfulness is the key to getting out of that state of going through the motions. It is the way, the path to increased joy and just a more resonant, fulfilling life. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you guys enjoyed that episode, and I will see you at the next one. Have a great day.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. Ready to create a life you don't want to escape from? Download your free Blueprint for Change now. This incredible workbook includes some of my favorite coaching tools and will help you get clear on what you need more and less of in your life. Grab it at www.wendymccallum.com/blueprint. That's www.wendymccallum.com/blueprint.